right, people, welcome back to Drug Dealing. So today we have a very interesting and fun episode, hopefully, for you. It's the beginning of the year, and what better way to start the year by forecasting what we think is going to happen. So Kenny and I have put together some hot takes and predictions for you for 2025. Neither of us have heard each other's predictions yet, and so this is going to be a complete surprise to us. I wrote about some of these on my Substack, but Kenny was kind enough not to read them for the sake of making this recording a little bit more interesting. So we're going to go back and forth on our predictions for biopharma in 2025. Completely organic reactions here. So I'm interested to see what you have in store, Kenny. Hopefully you like mine. I'm not sure. You tend to. I think you're a little more hot takey than me. So yours might be a little better than me. So I'm already a little shy and jealous about this, but let's see where this goes. Do you anything you want to say? I was going to say maybe you should start first, but I don't know if you want to tee up anything else for
I
the
already
audience.
disagree with all of yours. I don't. No, I think I think the most important thing is that, these are created organically, Shivu. I think, and this is our first time doing it. We're new to this podcast. And I think our idea was to just share how we might envision the next few months. We tether ourselves to a year because that's an easy time point. But in the near future, here's how we kind of think of the space. And I thought of also getting deep into a scientific call, but this time I didn't do that, even though that's a lot of what you and I get involved with, although there is one that's kind of related to that. So I think it's the most important thing is we have not heard each other's views on things. There may be overlap, there may not. So do you want to get started or do you want me to?
You get started. I was just going to say for the audience, judge us on what we get right, not what we get wrong. Just forget all the stuff we get wrong and only remember the stuff we get right. That's and every prediction, it's never right or wrong. It's just always early. So eventually these will be right, most likely. But yeah, why don't you get started? I want to hear what you have to say first.
Okay, so take a step back. 2024 was a rough year for M&A. And I think it was very disappointing. And the sector had a lot of issues. There were a lot of macro pressures and other things going on. And unfortunately, that much of that is sustained this year. But I think when you take a step back and look at 2024, the M&A scene was very, very disappointing. And so I think one of the banks put out a note indicating that there were no deals north of $5 billion in enterprise value. That's pretty significant because that's not a really high mark given the balance sheets of a lot of the players in our space, in particular big pharma and some of the biopharma companies. So I think those pressures, unfortunately, that existed in 2024, they are likely to persist in 2025, particularly the macro backdrop, interest rates, and we have a new curveball this year in policy. There's a lot of appointees in some of the divisions of the healthcare industry that could be very interesting for our space. And I think those pressures
are talking about.
Is there just one? I think there's more than one.
It's true. There's a what is it called? There's like an Avengers of pharma policymakers now.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And so I think those pressures are going to continue this year. There's that new curveball. But what I don't think is going to happen is that we're going to have another dismal year for M&A. I think it's easy to say, like, when you have a historically bad period, you're not going to repeat that this year. I think that's the easy claim. And frankly, that is the claim I'm making. Am I going to claim we're going to have a 6 billion EV takeout? It's not about that. Are we going to have a mega merger, something that actually gets on the Lena Khan's predecessor? Are they going to get involved? I think a lot of things are going to come into play here, FTC and others, policy, that are going to be difficult, but I don't think we're going to have another bad year for M&A. So what am I saying? I'm not going to call out big deals. I'm not going to say I think that's what's going to happen, but I think there's likely to be more activity. And those assets that have shown, scientific translation into clinical commercial promise, I think they're going to be coveted this year. And I think there could be a play for some of those companies and or assets. Not all M&A may come in a full-on takeout. They may come in the form of perhaps very attractive and large deals, but I do think this year will be better for M&A for our sector.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. And I think lately too, there's been a refocus on all the patent cliffs coming up, especially in the midterm for, some of the biggest companies in our sector, both nivolumab from BMS and Keytruda from Merck are going to go off patent in 2028. There's a whole slew of other major revenue drivers from big pharma that are going to come off, their balance sheets significantly in a big way. And, you would think that like a lot of these companies have already started to do acquisitions, right? Like Merck went on a spree of, getting that, the TL1A and Acceleron and, all these deals that they had done. But like, you know, I think smarter people than me have like done the math on it and they don't think that that's enough and they still have a lot of money. And so I could see, and I would agree with you that there's probably more M&A happening. I do think the tilt is probably going to be a bit more, the tilt is going to be the same in that I think these big companies are still looking for very de-risked assets. And pharma, I think now is still entrenched in their position of like, yes, we can scale this innovation. We don't want to be doing it ourselves. Like, um, let's take a calculated risk on like really good phase 3 data, plug that into our commercial system and let that thing run with it. Or, you know, take, maybe earlier stage bets, but on, kind of more well-validated MOAs. Like you see it with kind of what, Merck did with PD-1 VEGF, right? They looked at the Summit data and the Summit data looked great. And they're like, oh, why don't we just get another Chinese PD-1 VEGF too? Or even with like GLP-1s and stuff like that, like where there's MOAs that are, probably a little bit more de-risked, even just like referentially de-risked because of, other modalities in that space. I think those are probably the areas where it's gonna stick. I don't see like a ton of M&A happening with like companies with, like phase 1 proof of concept data and like early phase 2 data. I think, because of the overhang of needing to refill the, the inline marketing, revenue drivers for all of these companies, they're still going to lean a little bit more towards, like late stage de-risked assets or assets like on the verge of being, meaningfully de-risked in a pivotal study. I don't know. What do you think about that?
No, I think you're right. And actually, if you go into some of the specifics, this is not a disparagement on the company. These things happen. But AbbVie, with its acquisition of Cerevel, so neuroscience,
Yeah, good
and
one.
that was a very prominent blow up. And so when you look at that company and think about, first of all, they're known for, eye and eye inflammation and those types of disease. You think of them as like they're working through the next phase of Humira. And so they have this Skyrizi and Rinvoq for these similar types of indications. And so they want to create a presence in other areas, oncology and all these other things. And so they had this play in neuroscience. Cerevel blew up on them. And this is common, and unfortunately in neurology, you have a lot of these studies late stage that look pretty promising, even with durable size phase 2s that just don't translate into pivotals. And so I think that could color some of these companies' M&A appetite, Shivu, for things that are de-risked, or maybe in CNS, because these are the fails that are unfortunately common, maybe there's other therapeutic areas that do make sense. And so I agree with you. I think that de-risked and commercially positioned attractive assets are the way to go.
Yeah, the neuro one is really interesting to me because last year, for Substack, I made a prediction that like neuroscience was going to be back, and we're gonna go back to all these like old school big pharma indications, like like dementia and Alzheimer's and psychiatry and all that stuff, and it didn't like fully really manifest. There was like a couple interesting acquisitions in psychiatry and but not like the full swing back into it. And I think it shows that like we're still at a place in some of these disease areas where we're, scientifically maybe a little bit more behind the 8 ball than we are in some of these other disease areas. Like it's still really hard, right? Like in psychiatry, there was that company recently, Numora, that people were really excited about, and they were doing, I think they had a very thoughtful approach to, or thoughtful corporate strategy, I would say, for how they were set up, right? They're trying to do, like, I always talked about it as like applying like an oncology lens to neuroscience. Like, how do you do targeted neuroscience? Like, find a biomarker, isolate that patient population, and like give them the drug that, would theoretically be best suited for them. And, I think it was like a captive opioid receptor that they used in MDD, and it just didn't work, and it just goes to show you like placebo effect is really tough to beat in these indications. I saw it with Vertex. You and I both have spoken very highly of Vertex. They're just like this machine and like really well-run company, but their pain drug didn't really look that great relative to placebo. And it's just, some of these indications are just really tough, especially the ones where placebo effect is very prominent. We still haven't figured out a way to kind of minimize that. And so, we'll see what happens. But generally, I agree with you. I think there's going to be like a reversion to a little bit more M&A next year. I don't know that we're going to get these like big mega mergers like the Celgene BMS type mergers that we've had. Like, I think if you look at the space, right, there's a ton of really big companies and there's some really small companies, and like all the people in the middle, there's like maybe 3 or 4 companies that are like mid-size biopharma. It's like your Beijing's and your, Argenix's and, that kind of group. And like everybody else is either really big or really small. And I don't know. I don't know that we're going to get this like big mega merger, but I could see a lot of like small 5, 6, 8, $9 billion acquisitions.
I could, and I watched Lena Khan's exit interview on CNBC because I was really curious. A lot of her answers were very high level and didn't really deviate much off script. I think she is an intelligent person, but I think she took a position that made innovation very difficult. And in particular, I do think there are some biotechs that were harmed by her department's approach. I was not a fan of it. And so with her being gone, one of the things she said was, well, the courts upheld many of their decisions. And so she said that's one of the reasons why we know we're justified. But I think, with her being gone, there's very likely to be, Shivu, more interest. Again, not necessarily in the mega mergers, but just to the idea that, look, if you're a pharmaceutical company and you're the lead in this space, and there's a different target or modality and you don't have it, I don't think there's as much concern around that company delving into that space. Because they're sometimes the right player. Some of these studies are very difficult to enroll. They're not in the US. Maybe they're prominent in Europe or other parts of the world, where maybe getting patients is harder. I think those things are back on the table with her being gone. So that's something that could also be helpful as well.
I mean, think about the old school big pharma indications and, like obesity. The whole GLP-1 trend has swung us back more into, bringing more of those disease areas in focus, just given the breadth of indications that mechanism of action is relevant in, right? It's not just obesity and diabetes. It's, potentially Alzheimer's disease, right? I think Novo has like an Alzheimer's readout coming up next year, potentially with GLP-1s. It's, HFpEF and HFrEF and hypertension and, all these other types. I mean, those are like old school big pharma indications, right? And the reason that I say that is because those are like huge studies that you have to run, massive, thousands of patients. And like, I don't know that like the funding environment is even, ready to comprehend like the type of raise you would have to do to run that type of study, and even if you like, I think about it sometimes like working in oncology, right? Like nowadays, it used to be that in oncology, you run a single arm phase 2, you get an accelerated approval and, you're good to go. Like, you can maybe raise after that and you can start up your confirmatory study and go from there. But nowadays you have to have that confirmatory study ready to go already, online before the FDA will even get you that approval. And that, means that you got to have a little bit more money on hand to run that. And some, small companies aren't like, financially equipped to do that. And it is these like big gorillas that are able to put the financial and honestly, like the people power behind it to like run those studies, all the ClinOps people and, in every single country and having like med affairs reps in every single, all that type of stuff, right? Like it's big pharma has like built that over, dozens and dozens of years.
And all you can do, you're correct, you need the machine. All you can do, and this is perhaps a bit of a tangent, but it actually does flow into what we're saying here. A lot of these smaller companies, it's not even well understood. Again, one of the reasons we do this podcast is to kind of help evangelize our sector to people who may not live and breathe the space all the time. Our predictions are for anybody. But I think what's not well understood if you don't work in the space is how hard it is to run those programs. Just to get to the clinic, to get your drug to the clinic. So all the non-human primates, the mouse models, all the preclinical work that you have to do, the safety database you have to generate for the FDA before you get to humans, before you get to phase 1, to basically be at IND stage is at least 20 to 25 million. And for some things could be even more. I'm talking small molecules. You go to biologics, it could be a little more. That is only just to get to humans. The surveillance and the regulatory requirements after that get even more difficult. So if you have a molecule like a GLP-1 and you say, oh, I don't want to do obesity and insulin control and all these other things, I want to try something new. You can't really take that risk when you're a small company. You have to go down the well-worn path and say, I'm going to do what all the other GLP-1s do in my phase 1, phase 2, and I'm going to show potentially better efficacy and hopefully better tolerability. That seems to be the play in this space, in particular GI issues for GLP-1s. And can you get the kind of weight loss? And now these other concerns with sarcopenia and muscle wasting as well. Do I have any biomarkers that can de-risk that? And then maybe a big pharma can come in and take it into all these other indications. A small company can't do that. They typically launch with very limited headcount, and it's very difficult to get these things done when you don't have the machine behind you.
100%. Should we go to mine now?
Please.
So related to yours, I'm going to make a prediction about somebody who's going to get bought this year. So I think, Vera Therapeutics, I think they're going to get bought this year. And so this is in an area I think, you know pretty well too, in kidney care and nephrology and all that. But so Vera has a drug called atacicept, which is essentially a B cell interferer. Basically, it targets BAFF and APRIL, these two B cell targets. And over time in this space, IgAN has kind of grown in significance. I would say it's like a pretty large indication. There's almost like I think like 130 or 150,000 of these patients in the U.S. Right. Generally, these patients are like, pretty young as well. And kidney care is, if you think about it, think about how big, for the audience, think about how big like DaVita's business is, right? DaVita, this like massive company that literally all they do is kidney care. All they do is, patients up to, I'm forgetting the word now, the dialysis machines. And once you're on a dialysis machine, as a patient, you're, it's all downhill from there. Like there's not much that can be done for you. And so eventually these patients with IgAN get like all these insults to their kidney because there's an autoimmune reaction, like your own immune system is attacking your kidneys and you lose kidney function. And eventually you might need dialysis or maybe a kidney transplant. And, it's all downhill from there, right? So there's this ability to, if there's new drugs that are coming into the space, which there are, right? Like Novartis has invested a ton of money in this space with complement inhibitors, with their own acquisition of this company, Chinook Therapeutics, last year or so. So it's an emerging market to me, which is really interesting. Big Pharma is like starting to invest a little bit more in it. You see AstraZeneca in this space as well. And it kind of reminds me a bit of like where PAH was way back when, right? It was kind of this like small, rare disease, but then you started seeing like guys like Gilead and Actelion and eventually J&J and all these companies get into this business, Bayer get into this business and start doing a lot of combo therapy in the space as well. And so IgAN's really interesting to me in that there's so many different mechanisms of action, all guided at like attacking different parts of the disease pathogenesis. But Vera's in an interesting place because they and a bunch of other companies, like Takeda and Vertex and a few others, are working on this sort of like B cell depletion, B cell interference part of the pathogenesis of this disease, which could be like quite disease modifying. Doesn't seem like it's going to be some curative therapy, but it's going to be a significant improvement over what's available now, which are, mostly drugs that are either guided at suppressing inflammation, or drugs that are guided at, like reducing your blood pressure so that the blood pressure is not sort of insulting your kidneys significantly. And so I think they're in a really interesting phase. They have some phase 3 data that's supposed to come out this year, which, could be the trigger for a big company to come in and acquire them. They're kind of in that sweet spot too of like, they're kind of like 2.5-ish billion. And you could think about it too, like there's not just, IgAN is not like an individual, standalone indication. Like this mechanism of action is potentially useful across other types of, autoimmune nephrology type conditions, right? Maybe, lupus nephritis, maybe a bunch of other these types of diseases that attack your kidneys, right? So it is a market where you can like create an anchor in IgAN, and then from a commercial perspective, start using those same KOLs, that same network to build out into more indications. So I think it's like almost two predictions in one. I think Vera is going to get bought out, and I think nephrology is going to be a really important PA over the next 1 to 2 years, where we see a lot of big pharma interest through acquisitions and through internal development as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. It's bold. I like you calling out a company that could get bought out. I think that's interesting. Vera's done really well. If you look at the stock, I don't have it open in front of me, but I just remember that it went meteoric. I think throughout 2024, there might have been a particular event. IgAN is really interesting. There's a lot of development in that space. There's Travere Therapeutics. They're developing in there as well. And I remember reading some sell side notes indicating that there's a lot of optimism for that company, given what they're doing in IgAN, potentially could be first. And so first doesn't always mean you're the winner, but I agree with you that nephrology is a very interesting space. We've had some companies express interest in going public in that space actually just recently here over the last few days. And I also think of, what's been going on with Vertex acquiring Alpine Immune Sciences, Novartis and Chinook. There is a lot of interest in nephrology. And, it was a graveyard for years. I'm thinking of Aurinia, which had voclosporin. And I remember talking to that company 10, 12 years ago, and they just had zero interest from investors. But suddenly, as the science has gotten better and as we've understood the mechanisms a little more, there's a lot more interest in the space. I could see takeouts continue in nephrology. It seems to have gotten white hot very quickly, and it tends to persist over time versus dropping off. So I think that's a very interesting one. And just one quick thing on that. GLP-1s are not a cure-all for all things. Unfortunately, if you look at them, it'd be great if they solved all problems, but they don't. And a lot of these smaller nephrology indications, you might get some benefit, but you're not going to get the type of on-targeted benefit a patient might need that B-cell depletion may be able to provide. And so while people might say like, oh, just pop a GLP-1, maybe that's the way to go. For some of these things, you might get some benefit, but for some, you won't. And so there's a lot of opportunity for companies to come in and address these problems. One other thing I might share on the idea of this company being taken out is, if these indications are small, Shivu, in particular on the rare side, there is a somewhat lukewarm interest from pharma to pursue those. I'm not saying it obviously can't happen. Vertex bought Alpine. There's indications that could be of interest, but I think from BD friends that you and I have, they say things like, well, so we're going to spend all this money to acquire this asset and build the commercial and clinical infrastructure for something where there's only 90,000 patients. And that's globally. I may have 30 in the US, 25 in the EU, and the rest I got to go hunt down across the world. Very limited profitability versus a common disease where I might have to address 2 million, 3 million, and it's easier. To some extent, I think that may keep a lid on some of the rare disease company takeouts. It's not necessarily specific to your idea, but I want to put that out there that there is tepid interest from a lot of the pharma players. Now, given all the policy issues this year, given that the FTC may have a more favorable view, I don't know how that might change things, but that's just one thing I want to put out there because I thought rare was going to be even more attractive to acquirers over the last few years, but it really hasn't been.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think the attraction to IgAN is all the other indications too that you could potentially unlock because of B-cell depletion or B-cell interference. And you see it too, like with all the, umpteenth CD19 targeting whatever asset in, RA and lupus and et cetera, right? It's just, if you deplete B cells, there's a ton of indications that you're eligible for. One thing I'll call out, like when I was doing the deep dive on this indication on Substack a little while ago, I was really surprised with how many big companies are already in this space. So you have the likes of Takeda, Biogen, who acquired HiBio to get an IgAN asset, Into, Roche, AstraZeneca, Novartis. So I think there's Vertex, obviously. So you already have like 5 or 6 of these, big players in the space. And it's a small market now, but I think it's growing. You can start to see, because of the different MOAs in the space, combination therapy come into play, people on multiple different types of therapies. Novartis is already kind of like addressing kind of the full stack, getting to 3 different MOAs in their pipeline in this particular space. So I think it'll grow quite a bit. And I think, how sometimes these BD things grow. I mean, we've both been a part of it. So a lot of, not every company is like this, but we always hear stories about like, oh, this company acquired, this thing, like we should go do that too. Like, let's go look into it, right? It is a little bit of like, oh, why did these guys do that thing? Should we look at that too? And I think we might start to get to this, but I think the Vera acquisition, if it happens, will be a trigger for that. I think a lot more big companies will be starting to look into that space, also dependent on who the acquirer is. If it's one of these, if it's like a Merck or a BMS, one of these companies where they have a good reputation in their acquisitions, I think a lot of their peers will go, why did they dip into that space? Maybe we should be looking into that too.
Yeah, it's interesting about the herd mentality. There's definitely a lot of that. I'll make one last comment, then maybe you can start with your 2 and I'll go to mine after that. It was interesting, with Merck and its Keytruda franchise going generic by the end of this decade. It's a few years away, actually, at this point. And they have sub-Q and some other things with life cycle management. There was some commentary they made in the past about, this PD-1 VEGF space, and that maybe the, quote, responsiveness of that particular population to this antigen or this particular target, it may not, be as strong in other populations. And so you almost saw from them a lack of willingness or interest to dip into the space. And then maybe a handful of weeks later, they made a play for the PD-1 VEGF space. And so that is a space that has gotten very hot since Summit has led the charge. There's now been a lot of interest in the space. There's BeyondTech, there's a bunch of other names as well. And I do think while herd mentality is part of it, I think this is also something that needs to be said. It's over a $50 billion indication. A herd can survive with $50 billion. It's okay to have a herd go into that. And frankly, when the herd goes into that, competitive pressures always produce better outcomes for patients. So I do think there can be herd mentality in some of the indications you're talking about. Perhaps they're not as big, but that tends to be a good thing for patients.
Yeah, 100%. GLP-1's like the classic example of that, right? I think we're going to start to see like even more GLP-1 acquisitions from companies that like don't even have nothing to do with obesity, right? Like, Roche bought that one company, Car, whatever, and Roche is not an obesity company there, but there's, it seems like it's going to be a big space. Like we should just make sure we're participating. And if it's 100, 120, 200, however, whatever we want to, clock this obesity market at, or this GLP-1 market at, like you were saying, like a herd can survive in a big environment like that. Should I go next again, or
yes,
do you want to go?
Go
Okay.
ahead.
So
and then I'll respond. Yeah.
So related to your PD-1 VEGF point, I think over the course of this last year of 2024, obviously like all the summit data was super eye-catching, and I think it's been like a real, lightning strike moment for a lot of big pharma companies to look overseas in China to in-license assets with, relatively de-risked MOAs, albeit kind of in a combinatory format. And I think in oncology, so my prediction is that these bispecific antibodies really stay hot in oncology next year. They're going to see a lot more acquisitions, but even outside, more so outside of PD-1 VEGF. I mean, I think there's, definitely going to be more companies that, look to in-license these PD-1 VEGF assets, just given, how big that market could be and, how many assets are available in that space. But, in oncology, if you remember back to like, 2023, 2022, the big wave was, ADCs are back, right? All these HER2 targeting ADCs, HER3, TROP2, etc. That was kind of the big swing back in oncology, and ADCs were back in vogue, after the great work that like Daiichi and AstraZeneca did to show that like, hey, this, we've kind of made made significant progress in this modality. And I think because of this PD-1 VEGF stuff, I think a lot more of the oncology acquisitions in this space are going to be in bispecific or multi-specific modalities. I mean, there's a couple companies kind of in late stage studies that are doing really interesting things, right? Especially in like head and neck cancer. So companies like Bicara that have like an EGFR, TGF beta bispecific, Maris that has a EGFR, LGR5 bispecific. There's a bunch of other companies that are doing that, but I think for a time too, maybe 5 years ago or so, people were working on like, PD-1, 4-1BB bispecifics, and they just kind of didn't go anywhere. But now it seems like, interest is reinvigorating in that space. And I think, especially in oncology, we're going to see, more acquisitions, more deals being done focused on multi-targeting antibody formats. I mean, there's been great data. Obviously, J&J's EGFR targeting asset is just beat AstraZeneca's in a study recently in lung cancer, and like so I think there's more being done in this asset class, and the science has advanced quite a bit. And I think especially in oncology, the theme is going to be bispecifics in terms when it comes to deals.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I think it's going to be talking about. I don't know of anything else that's more white hot right now, except for perhaps the GLP-1 space. I mean, it's just gone meteoric with the amount of interest in the space. I think one thing I would add is, yes, there will be new molecules, new moieties will be added. bispecific, trispecific. We're going to have this type of linker, all these things for ADCs. I think what's exciting as well is, I grew up at a time where breast cancer was a death sentence. And then some years ago, I remember reading in the literature that now I don't remember what subpopulation of breast cancer it was, but it was one of the larger ones. Basically, those women can reach the average lifespan, 78 years. What I think is most attractive in all this is you're going to have novel science pushing the boundary, and then you're going to have a bunch of combo plays where people are going to do ADCs and a bispecific and a trispecific. And what's going to happen is some companies are not going to win, but some companies are going to do very well. And it's going to be because they found a better treatment approach for patients. And hopefully, as you are later in lines of treatment where the tolerability tends to be quite dismal, that also gets better as well. That's just the natural evolution. So I think not only is that space going to get white hot, Shivu, I think they're going to be some, if you look at Keytruda's development history, it's insane how much money they spent just getting Keytruda to what it is now. So Keytruda is approved in over 60 indications. But what's astonishing to me is as much revenue as that drug generates, which is about $30 billion annually or so, and has generated that for some time, they spent over $60 billion just developing Keytruda in all those various indications. And if you look at them compared to BMS, it looks like almost they had a lot more prescient calls, but I also think they just tried a lot more. So they're going to be companies who try some random things. Oh, we're going to try this indication that's not as well known, Merkel cell carcinoma relative to, non-small cell lung cancer, smaller indications that may all of a sudden just get wiped out over the next decade because of these combo indications, of these combo plays, and also novel science. So I agree with you. I think it's going to stay white hot. I don't think it's just a 2025 thing. I think if you use this again in 26 when we do this, I think you'll still be right.
Yeah, I think so. All right, good stuff. All right, you want to go next?
Yeah, mine's
another find one we're going to disagree on, man. This isn't good for the viewers here or the listeners here.
This is another thematic play. So this is one where we have to step outside of our sector to understand a lot of what's going on and why this is relevant. So I have another sector call, and it's kind of on the macro play. So biotech tends to perform well in a year where investors need to be defensive, and the market's performance the last 2 years were so strong, 20+% returns last year in particular. It's going to make it hard for the market to do that consistently in every year. So could it happen this year? Sure. But, January is already off to a rough start. Things are looking a bit difficult right now for markets. The job market's really strong. The Fed may not be as incentivized to reduce rates. There was an expectation this year coming in that there'd be 2 rate cuts this year. Now there's an argument based on today's data that there may be no rate cuts this year. That makes things very difficult for long duration asset sectors like ours. But I think in particular, we do tend to perform well in defensive times. That is normal for biotech. So this could be a defensive period, even though it's harder with higher rates. But also, if you look at what attracted a lot of investor interest the last year and maybe even the last 18, 24 months was AI in the big tech industry. And so my call for this year is that AI is likely to be more tepid. If you look at CapEx for a lot of the big tech companies, it's come down actually recently. And what that tells me is AI may cool off a little bit. I also think there's going to be a thematic issue with CEOs coming in and saying, we're going to cut all these jobs because I'm automating stuff. I think some of that's going to have bad optics. I think the United Healthcare CEO murder could be involved in that, where executives just feel like they shouldn't do those types of things. It's somewhat inevitable it will happen. But what I think could happen is AI as an investment gets pulled back this year. So what does that mean? Investors may need to seek alternate paths to innovation. And I think that could be a driver for maybe some tailwinds for the biotech, for pharma, for the biopharma industry. So I think I think AI cooling off is a partial or intermittent cooling, but I do think our sector could benefit from it.
So it's really interesting. I kind of had the same thing. I mean, I think I took a different angle on it, but I kind of had the same thing. I like your kind of more macro angle on it in terms of like where companies are spending their dollars. I think especially in tech, I've heard a lot of, tech pundits talk about, all these tech companies have, bought all this compute from NVIDIA, but there's no ROI on it yet. And eventually, investors are going to be like, well, where's all the stuff? Like, what the heck are we getting for all this money that you're spending, on this? Like, should like NVIDIA's, making money hand over foot, but like, what are you guys doing with all this stuff that you're buying from them? And I do think I agree with you in that, like, pharma too, I think maybe this is a little too cynical, but I'll say it anyway. I think a lot of pharma used AI over the last like 2, 3 years as like a little virtue signaling, like, oh yeah, we're doing AI, like we're partnering with NVIDIA to use this LLM model and like I haven't like seen one productive thing that any of these companies have talked about like how AI has enhanced their business and translated to this much, savings in their bottom line and all that stuff, especially as it relates to drug development. And like that's how if we're keeping score in our industry, it's how many drugs did you get approved?
Yeah.
What did you add to the armamentarium to like impact a patient's life and a doctor's ability to improve a patient's life? And I haven't seen any of that yet. And so my related take, and I think I think yours is like the umbrella take, and mine probably fits into that, which is we have this. Gartner got very famous for this like Gartner hype cycle chart
Yeah.
that they had. You start with the technology trigger, it goes up and it's like the peak of inflated expectations. There's this like trough of disillusionment, and you kind of pick back up and level back at like this plateau of productivity, so to speak. And I think we're at least in biopharma, I think over the course of this next year, we'll realize that we were at like peak inflated expectations for AI. And I think people are going to pull out of it. There's going to be a pullback. And a lot of it is going to be like, show me, like we've been in this era up until now of understanding the potential of AI and like selling the story about like, yes, like theoretically, I think any reasonable mind would agree, like if we apply these tools the right way, it's going to accelerate a lot of stuff like across our species, not just like within biopharma. But I think over the course of this next year, we're going to get to the like prove it phase of this, right? Like show me that we're, de-risking, like getting clinical proof of concept for these like AI generated assets, right? Show me like the money that we're saving. Show me the speed, that we're getting from, accelerating clinical trials and finding patients and all that type of stuff. So I think like this is going to be a real prove it year for companies who've spent a lot in AI. Like people are going to go, what are we getting for this, right? And if we're not getting anything, like let's spend this money, let's do something else with this money. And it's not to say that AI is bad or anything, but I think as any hype cycle goes, like this is the cliff. I think this year is the cliff, and it's going to pick back up, and then we're going to get to a better place over the next few years about seeing real tangible developments come out of AI used by biopharma companies.
I agree. I think that's an interesting call too. It does align pretty close with mine. How about I'll go with my third. This is my final, and then I'll hand it over to you for yours, and look forward to your thoughts as well. So there's some therapeutic areas that just haven't seen innovation in years. And cardiology is one of those where there's been a slew of approvals. Some of the targets are novel, some of them are not. But in particular, within cardiology, there's one space that impacts up to 2/3 of all adults across the planet, by the way, where I think it's on the cusp of realizing novel targets, but in particular, novel routes of administration. And that is hypertension. Hypertension now, for the first time, this is something near and dear to my heart. We're probably going to talk about it more in the future because there's some things I'm working on in this space. But hypertension in particular knows exclusively small molecules, unless you're an ambulatory patient. It's all small molecule. The entire treatment paradigm is small molecule. And with that comes Cmax issues. With that, in an asymptomatic disease comes adherence issues. And what I'm noticing is an idea I have in the space, and then some big players, 3 large companies in particular, they're looking at novel targets for hypertension that are not oral. And I think as I was working on my idea independent, I wasn't even paying attention. My idea dates back about 18 months or so. Mine is not oral as well. And I think it's because people are starting to see hypertension is sitting on what I would consider the beginning of a Cambrian moment, where there's going to be a lot more interest. We've understood hypertension scientifically to some extent via maybe a handful of mechanisms for about 50 years, 50, 70 years or so. But we're really going to drill down into that. And I'm not saying it's going to be patient by patient hypertension approaches like personalized medicine, but I think this shotgun approach is no longer the way to go. In particular, orals have their limits. And so I do think we're heading into a Cambrian moment in a subset of cardiology, because cardiology does have, by the way, a lot of non-oral Shivu. For example, look at PCSK9. It's an amazing drug. It's very important. It's specific to hypertension. I think it's novel targets, and I also think it's novel routes of administration.
Yeah, I like this one. I'm glad you just given, how much you and I have talked about the stuff that you're working on. I'm glad you brought this one up. And I completely agree. And I think the there's a nice connection here with the GLP-1 space in that, you know, these drugs have gone like through the roof, right? GLP-1s, but I think the part that gets lost in it is how good these injectors are that these GLP-1s are, right? They're all injections. You got to, stab yourself in the thigh or in the stomach or in the arm, but people call it like, oh, you're going to get a jab, but it's not even a jab. It's like this little, and then you're good to go. And I think the compliance that's come with these obesity drugs, obviously some of it is probably fueled by the fact that like there's this positive reward mechanism of, oh, if I keep taking this drug, I'm going to lose weight, etc. And I think for the hypertension space, that's probably going to be something that you have to contend with, right? Which is like hypertension's tough. Like you don't always feel it necessarily. Like most people just don't feel it. It's something that like you go to your doctor says, hey man, like you got high blood pressure. And they're like, well, it's not really impacting my life, but it's one of these things like, hey, you got to take it seriously. Otherwise, like you never know what's going to happen. Right. And like the physical benefit of like taking the drug and what you get for it might not be there. I mean, that's always been the thing with hyperlipidemia also, right? Like it's, oh, let me take this cholesterol medication and like, I don't know. I don't notice like a performance benefit necessarily, but I do think because of the GLP-1s, there's going to be less of like an uphill battle of going like, hey, get this, injectable drug, right? Like it's this tiny little prick, like you won't even see it. You won't even notice it. And, if you're able to do this and do combinations with that in a very easy, convenient way, I think there's a really nice space where these things can play. So I'm glad that you brought this one up.
One last thing I'll share, and I don't mean to hijack the flow from you sharing your last idea here. I think it needs to be said, and this is something for folks in our industry, maybe folks who are not. It applies to everybody. When you ingest a drug, the body has to do a lot to metabolize it, and some drugs get converted into what's considered their active form. When that happens, you need a lot more drug to get to the active form so it can do what it needs to do in your body, engage with the target, do what it has to do. When you go from an oral to an injection, it is very common that you need much less drug. So when you talk to doctors and say, oh, typically I would need X when you're an oral, but if I'm an injection, maybe I only need, 0.25X, a quarter as much. That makes it easier for treaters in a way, because the side effect profile, Shivu, is much better. Not only that, as you and I know, a lot of safety signals tend to come with Cmax PK issues with drugs. When you use less drug and you have a long-acting approach, your peaks and troughs operate in a much tighter band. And what does that translate to? First of all, more consistent serum levels is better for the patient. They may not know it, they're certainly not going to feel it. But that's the goal of drugs, is to operate in a tighter band for the patient. So you don't have these ups and downs, which is where the body starts to show some of its issues and you have side effects. When you have these approaches as an injection, while it's not as pleasant as a pill, the outcomes are significantly more pleasant. And so I think that's what we're seeing here now. As long-acting technology, as science has gotten better at understanding all these things, there's going to be so much more improvement in not just hypertension, but I think that's going to be one of the indications in this year and coming years that will benefit.
Awesome. So we'll end with mine. This one, I don't know how hot takey this is, but it's just something that really stuck out to me. Stood out. I don't know why I would say stuck out. That's not a word.
I like your vocabulary today. That and hot takey.
Yeah, hot takey is a word now. Hot takey is a word. Especially in the podcast community, hot takey is a word. Stuck out is not, but English is a bastardized language anyway. We can make stuck out a word. So, I was watching a lot of football over the holiday, and like the NFL had, which recently, like Netflix got their first ever live NFL game, and they had two over the course of like 2 weekends, basically, or two days, basically. And it was kind of cool to see, like, just, Netflix have like live sports. They had commercials as well. And literally every single one of these commercials was bum ba dum bum bum, an obesity drug commercial. Like
Uh,
every single time that they cut to commercial, it was a Zepbound ad or an
wow.
Ozempic ad, or and I think 99, I want to say, this is, don't quote me on this, but it felt, at least like the vibes felt like 95 to 99% of these ads were all pharma ads, and mostly for obesity drugs and GLP-1. So that gives you the sense of like scale of how popular these things are. And like they are just shoving this stuff down your throat. Like, hey, this is the drug of the future. This is what, you know, it's going to be all up in your face. So my prediction is digital ad spend for big pharma is going to reach like all-time highs like we've never seen it before over the course of this next year, right? This is paired with kind of two things, right? If you peel back and step away from pharma for a second, there's a big shift that's happening in TV and media, like traditional cable networks, inline media, so to speak, is going down, right? So all the like, buying your cable channel and buying ad buys on, like late night television and all that stuff is going down because viewership on inline media is going down, right? People are not flipping on their TV set and, watching TV as much as they are going on YouTube and like doing all this on demand digital forms of watching content, right? Amazon Prime Video, Netflix, HBO Max, Peacock, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? There's so many, Hulu, there's so many more digital platforms that have on-demand TV that people have shifted their viewership attention to. Even if you want to loop in stuff like TikTok and Instagram and that type of stuff in there, again, like the advantage that those types of media have are that they can be a lot more targeted, right? They've collected a
Uh,
lot more data on you, and pharma can go and sit there and like very targetedly give ads to the right type of audience that they want. From a bang from your buck perspective, it is a better dollar spent in terms of advertising going, advertising on a Netflix, advertising on a Hulu, where you can really target your customer compared to something like inline TV where you just, are buying stuff on channel 5, whatever, and you don't know who's watching at that time. You have a general idea, but you don't, right? And so I think this next year, you're going to see insane amounts of pharma ad spend on digital platforms because it's so targeted. But the flip side of that is that, the reason why they're doing it obviously is to influence, you as a potential customer to like ask your doctor about that specific product, which the flip side of it is, especially with how competitive this GLP-1 space is going to be, I think we're going to actually like reach a new era where like patient empowerment in their decision-making process is going to be super, super important, right? It is going to be a lot of, hey, ask your doctor about this, ask your doctor about that. And given how widespread, especially GLP-1s are going to be in our society, especially in US society, over the course of the next several years, I think pharma is very incentivized to like build a brand, like a brand identity with the everyday person. And that the best way to do that is like through these very targeted mechanisms of ads on streaming platforms where you can very granularly target the right consumer versus something like traditional linear TV. So I mean, it's been going up year over year. Like there's been a shift in pharma spend, right, from less linear TV to more digital spend. And I think that's freaked out a lot of these TV networks as well, right? Like pharma is, really propping up the CNNs and the CBSs and, the NBCs, like your kind of standard news channels a lot. And, the shift over is like really threatening a lot of their business, right? I think that's why you see like CNN got acquired by Discovery and, all this other type of stuff, right? So there's this whole impact of how pharma ad spend is actually impacting these other sectors. And I think it's only going to exacerbate even further, right? Especially with GLP-1s kind of being this really well-suited class of medicines for this specific disease of obesity that is, like right time, right moment for being like kind of the perfect indication for pharma to really focus on ad spend for individuals. Because that's the person who's like really, I think if we look at um, how you decide like what drug to take, in a lot of indications, it's mostly a person just going, yeah, I'm just going to do whatever my doctor says, right?
Yeah.
If you have
Yep.
cancer, like a lot of times, cancer patients have good advocacy and all that, but they, for the most part, like your doctor has a lot of weight on like, hey, this is what you're going to get
Yeah.
as, your drug, right? Even for, other indications as well, but like, because of the celebrity behind obesity, because of like all the ads that we have seen, this is going to start to feel a bit more like an iPhone versus Samsung type of market in some ways. Like who does the best commercials, who like has that, thing that I'm remembering. And I think my prediction is that this ad spend is going to go up, but obesity is going to kind of be, and these GLP-1s are going to kind of be this like really interesting tipping point in, um, you know, who is the end person that you're trying to influence to decide to pick your drug. And I think it's going to be squarely kind of fall on like, how do I influence a patient to pick my product over someone else's versus influencing kind of a doctor to make that choice on behalf of a patient. What do you think about that?
I agree with you. It's going to uptick. I don't think it'll be a frictionless environment because a lot of the political appointees right now are, and they need to be appointed first, but a lot of them are not fans of pharmaceutical advertising. I do know as a fact that, in one of the major rare diseases, Amgen bought a company called Horizon, and its first year or two of launch, Horizon, before it got acquired, spent something like $100 million direct to consumer DTC in a rare disease, which was unheard of at the time, has now become the standard. Some of that is inflation when you look back, but some of it is just how companies are handling their approach with their marketing. So I think you're right. I think that's going to be the trend. And I think it's going to uptick this year, obesity being one of those things that impacts so much of the country. I think one more thing, Shivu, I would share is, I guess this would be a subset that's bolstering your idea. I am a fan of pharmaceutical advertisements, and it's not because I'm in the industry. It's because I'm a patient. And sometimes one of the best ways to learn about things is passively. We're all very busy. We have our devices and things like that. But when I'm watching something and an advertisement surprises me, I don't have my guards up and I'm a observer. And that is what TV ads can do or digital ads can do for medicines. And at a minimum, what it does is, even if you don't understand, even if you don't have the disease, maybe someone you do, you can mention it to them. What happens is you have that extra bit of information so that when you go to the physician, you can ask a question. And how many times have you and I lamented the fact that many people just assume their physician's word as the ultimate for what should happen, when that's not always the case, especially in rural parts of this country, something I feel very strongly about. And so spend going up from pharmaceutical companies, I think, is a net positive. I know a lot of people don't look at it as a very favorable thing. And a lot of people wonder, why do you have all those safety issues? They have to disclose those as well. But I like the idea of pharmaceutical spend for one reason: empower the patient to control their care. And so that is the ultimate value of pharmaceutical advertisements. I think it's great if they go up. It's not cheap. And I think, whether it's legacy TV channels or modern media today, however you get to the patient is the right way to get to them. And so I think it's a wonderful thing. I think your call is probably likely to be right. And I think it affects all things. It's not just big blockbuster indications like obesity. I think it affects rare too. I think it affects a lot of things.
Awesome. Yeah. And I just, maybe one point I want to make is for any, non biopharma people listening, the reason why I think we say we're for, more pharma ads is that, you as a patient, and I think you and I both approach our health this way, not saying we're the healthiest people on the planet, but like, I think you and I both, just from an operating perspective, approach our health this way. Like, you got to be in the driver's seat of your own health. You can't be a passenger. Like, it's stuff that's going in your body. You're the one who has to live with the choices. Like, you should be in the driver's seat for it. And you should ask your doctor. Like, if there's a drug that you see on TV and you think it's relevant for you, you should ask them about it. And if they're not going to go look it up and they're going to treat you like, you don't know what you're talking about, you got to find a new doctor, right? They're a partner in your health. They're not the one driving your health. Like, that's got to be you. You're in the driver's seat about your health.
Yeah, Shivu, I feel very strongly about that. I'm glad you say it. I want to drive that analogy home a bit further, just in case it's not clear to people, because driver's seat, I think, translates to many of us. But you mean it literally. You mean if you're trying to, let's say I am trying to go see a loved one, I'm trying to go to the store, I'm trying to go see a game. I don't just let the car go wherever it wants, whether it's Uber or whether I'm driving myself. I know where I'm going and I'm saying I want to go there. I need to get this done. It is literally the same thing for your own healthcare. To go into a physician's office or some care office and say, I have this problem, I don't know what it means, and be passive and allow them to drive where you're going is not something we would ever take when we want to go to an event or a specific place. You can never allow that for your own healthcare.
100%. And we should do this in a future episode about like, how to, what are quick things that the average person can do, like to prepare themselves for a doctor's appointment and that type of stuff. But especially with the way like LLMs and AI are now, like you can just ask it a question and say, what are like 5 questions I should ask my doctor about like this medication, right? Even if you yourself don't have like a good basis of understanding for it, there's so many tools now available to like put stuff in language that the everyday person can understand and give you enough information to like really be a driver in your own health. So yeah, love it, man. I thought we had really good predictions today. So not too many disagreements, but I thought we did a good job of even on the ones that we were similar on, a lot of stuff to build on. So anything you want to add before we close?
No, I'm looking forward to a wonderful 2025 where medicines can take one tick further to helping patients. I love the idea of, I love what our sector does. And, you and I have these calls. What I would say is maybe that doesn't always translate through. You and I are optimistic people and we want the best for our industry as it does what it's supposed to do, serve patients. So it's an exciting time. There's a lot of things. We talk about cancer, we talk about hypertension. There's so many things that are going to be better soon. And I'm excited to be a part of it.
Yeah, likewise. Happy 2025 to everybody that's listening. And, for the biopharma people listening, let's keep innovating. Let's keep, driving the science forward and getting drugs approved. I think that's, again, I think that's the best way to keep score is how many drugs did you get approved? That's the real measure of like, did you impact some patient's life? So we'll call that a wrap for this episode of Drug Dealing. Kenny and I will catch you in the next one with more interesting hot takes, more interesting topics to discuss. So take care, everybody.
Until next time. Thank you.